The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, painting the small town of Red Willow in shades of gold and rust. A lone figure trudged along the main street, her boots kicking up tiny clouds of sand with every hesitant step. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with clothes worn thin by travel and hardship, and eyes that carried the weight of someone who had been abandoned more times than she could count. In her hands she clutched a tattered bundle containing the few possessions she owned, a small satchel with a change of clothes, a faded photograph of a family she once had, and a worn journal filled with scribbles of hope and fear. The town itself was quiet, almost suspiciously so. The buildings were aged, their wooden facades weathered by years of sun and wind. Windows shuttered against the late afternoon glare, and the few townspeople who lingered on porches or in shops cast sideways glances at her as she passed. There was a collective sense of caution, the kind reserved for strangers whose stories could not yet be trusted. The girl tried to keep her head low, but she could feel the judgment in every glance, every whispered comment as she passed. Her stomach ached from hunger, and her feet ached from endless miles of travel. She had no destination beyond this town, no plan other than to survive another night. The thought of sleeping on the hard ground outside terrified her, but there was no one to offer guidance, no friendly hand to lead her somewhere safe. Doors remained firmly shut, and polite refusals disguised a deeper suspicion. She tried a few times, knocking gently, asking for work or even a simple meal, only to be met with silence or dismissive gestures. Her heart sank with every rejection, and a quiet despair began to creep in. It was then, at the edge of town near the sheriff's office, that she noticed a figure watching her from a distance. The man was older than most in town, perhaps in his 40s, and there was a solemn weight to his posture. He leaned casually against the doorframe, yet his eyes were sharp, observing every detail with careful attention. There was something about him that made her pause, a presence that seemed neither hostile nor indifferent but steady and measured. For the first time since she had entered Red Willow, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. The sheriff had seen many come and go, drifters and wanderers alike. But there was something different about this girl. She carried no swagger, no arrogance, only vulnerability wrapped tightly in determination. He knew instinctively that she needed help, and that the town's usual indifference would not suffice. He called out softly, his voice calm but carrying authority, and offered her a simple question: whether she had somewhere to stay for the night. The girl hesitated, uncertainty flashing across her features. She had learned over the years to expect disappointment, to brace herself for refusal. Yet the words, offered without judgment or hesitation, were like a lifeline tossed across a stormy sea. With a small nod, she accepted, following him as he led her to a modest room above the sheriff's office. It was not much, bare wooden floors, a simple bed, and a window that looked out over the quiet street. But it was safe, a refuge from the harsh world outside. As she closed the door behind her, the weight she had carried for so long seemed to shift slightly. She was still alone, still wary, but for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt a glimmer of hope that somewhere she might belong. The sheriff, standing just outside her door, watched silently, knowing that this was only the beginning of a story neither of them could yet imagine. The sheriff watched the young woman pause at the threshold of his office, her fingers gripping the strap of her satchel as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. He could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the hollowed cheeks, the dark circles beneath her eyes, and the way her shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of a life that had offered her little kindness. Red Willow had a reputation for being a town that survived on quiet routines and wary glances. But even here, the sheriff felt a tug of responsibility he could not ignore. He cleared his throat, careful to keep his voice gentle yet authoritative. "You look like you've had a rough road," he said. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" The girl's eyes flickered with caution. She had learned over years of rejection not to trust strangers, even those in uniform. Many had promised help only to disappear or turn cruel. She hesitated, unsure if this man was different or if he was just another polite stranger who would ultimately leave her to fend for herself. "No," she admitted softly, almost whispering. Her voice carried the fragile weight of someone unaccustomed to being offered choice or consideration. The sheriff nodded slowly, as if he understood more than her words conveyed. "I can offer you a room," he said. "It's nothing fancy, just above the office. Safe, quiet, and, Well, it's a place to rest. He paused, giving her space to respond, and noticed her hesitation. He had expected it.
Many would be wary, especially someone who had been turned away repeatedly.
You don't have to decide right this second, he added, but it's there if you need it. Her mind raced. A room above the sheriff's office was not just shelter. It was a symbol of trust. The thought of accepting help brought both relief and fear. Relief because the ache of loneliness had been unbearable. Fear because trusting someone again left her vulnerable. Yet despite her apprehension, she sensed an honesty in his tone she hadn't encountered in a long time. His offer was not laced with expectation, nor did it carry the faintest hint of judgment. It was simply help, plain and straightforward. Finally, with a small nod, she accepted. I'll take it, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. The sheriff's eyes softened, and he offered a reassuring smile, a gesture uncharacteristic for a man usually reserved and measured in demeanor. He stepped aside and led her through the back of the office, past the dusty shelves of ledgers and official papers, and up a narrow staircase to a modest room. The space was simple, a single bed with a neatly folded quilt, a wooden chair by a small table, and a window that overlooked the quiet street below. It lacked luxury, but it had the one thing she had been craving: safety. She set her satchel on the bed and sank into the chair, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease, if only slightly. The sheriff lingered in the doorway, his gaze steady but respectful. There was a quiet understanding between them, unspoken but palpable. This was a beginning, tentative and fragile, but a beginning nonetheless. "Dinner's simple," he said after a moment. "But if you're hungry, come down. I'll see you there." The girl nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips, a gesture that surprised even her. For the first time since she arrived in Red Willow, she felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps this town and this lonely sheriff could offer more than just shelter. Perhaps here she might find a reason to stay. And for the sheriff, as he descended the stairs back into his office, he felt a quiet shift in his own heart. He had offered her a room, yes, but in doing so, he had unknowingly opened the door to something deeper, the possibility of connection, of companionship, and perhaps even the family he thought he had lost forever. The first few days in the sheriff's house were filled with an uneasy rhythm, the kind that comes from two strangers learning to coexist under one roof. The young woman, still wary from a lifetime of rejection, moved quietly through the small space above the sheriff's office, careful not to disturb the order he had maintained for years. Every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified in her ears, and she worried constantly about overstepping, about showing weakness or vulnerability in front of someone whose life had been so clearly defined by authority and solitude. The sheriff, for his part, found himself watching her more closely than he intended. It wasn't intrusion, he told himself, but a quiet concern, a need to ensure she was safe, that she had what she needed. He was a man of habits, meticulous, steady, and controlled. Having someone else in the house disrupted that balance in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her presence brought new noises, new questions, and new emotions he had long buried under the routines of law enforcement and the memory of a lost wife. Their interactions were cautious. Breakfasts were eaten in polite silence, with only the occasional murmured comment about the weather or the town. The sheriff offered small gestures of kindness: a clean towel, a cup of warm coffee, a basket of freshly baked bread from the town's general store. Each act was deliberate, carefully measured to avoid overwhelming her, and yet each time, the woman recoiled slightly, not out of ingratitude, but because she was unaccustomed to generosity without expectation. One morning, as she attempted to make sense of her new environment, she accidentally dropped a plate while setting the table. The sound echoed through the house, and she froze, expecting the sharp rebuke she had faced countless times in the past. Instead, the sheriff appeared at the doorway, expression unreadable. "It's just a plate," he said simply. "Accidents happen." That single sentence, so unremarkable to most, carried a weight she hadn't realized she'd been craving. No criticism, no judgment, just calm acceptance. Evenings were the hardest. The quiet of the house amplified her insecurities. and she found herself retreating to the small room above the office, poring over her journal and replaying every interaction of the day in her mind. She feared she might be imposing that she didn't belong, that eventually the sheriff's patience would run thin. Yet, despite the tension, there were fleeting moments of warmth, a shared smile over a minor mishap, a polite conversation about the town, or the sheriff's rare stories of his past work. These small connections hinted at the possibility of trust, even if both were too cautious to fully embrace it. At the same time, the sheriff struggled with his own reservations. He had spent years shielding his heart, believing solitude was safer than attachment. Yet he found himself thinking about her when she wasn't there, wondering if she was warm enough at night, if she had enough to eat, if she felt safe. It was a slow, uncomfortable awareness of concern that he had not anticipated, and one he was reluctant to acknowledge. The tension reached a subtle climax one afternoon when a storm rolled in, drumming rain against the windows. The woman, attempting to close a loose shutter, nearly fell. The sheriff was at her side in an instant, steadying her with firm hands. Their eyes met, and in that moment the barriers between them shifted slightly. It was not yet trust and certainly not friendship, but it was recognition. Recognition that they were no longer strangers, that both were navigating a fragile new reality together, and that perhaps cautiously they could begin to rely on one another. By the end of the week, the routine had begun to settle into a fragile pattern. They spoke more freely, though carefully, and each gesture of kindness began to chip away at the walls they had both built. The sheriff's quiet authority provided safety, and her cautious optimism brought light into his otherwise lonely home. Uneasy beginnings, yes, but beginnings nonetheless, and every beginning carries the seed of something more. Days in the sheriff's house began to take on a rhythm that neither of them had expected. What had started as tense coexistence was slowly evolving into something softer, gentler, a quiet companionship that neither had dared to hope for. The young woman, once hesitant and guarded, began to feel the first flickers of safety and belonging in this small, orderly home. The sheriff, too, noticed subtle changes in himself, a sense of purpose beyond law enforcement, a warmth he hadn't felt since the loss of his wife. Their trust building began in small, almost imperceptible ways. She started leaving her satchel unpacked, letting her clothes hang openly rather than cramming them into a corner, a small signal that she felt secure enough to claim space in his home. The sheriff, in turn, allowed her autonomy, giving her freedom to manage the room however she wished while maintaining the boundaries that kept them both comfortable. It was a delicate dance of independence and connection, each learning how to coexist without fear or resentment. Meals became a particularly important ground for building trust. The sheriff, used to eating alone, began including her in routines, preparing breakfast while she swept the floor, sharing a simple lunch after town duties. They spoke cautiously, at first exchanging small observations about the weather or the town's news. Then gradually the conversations deepened. She asked questions about his work and he shared stories of past cases, not to boast, but to reveal fragments of the man behind the badge. She, in turn, hesitated at first but then began recounting parts of her past, small memories of childhood, bits of her family life and the loneliness that had followed her from town to town. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden glow through the window, they sat together in the quiet living room. She confessed her fear of being abandoned again, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not used to people letting me stay," she admitted. The sheriff, who had spent years shielding his own heart, nodded knowingly. "I know," he said softly, "and I won't ask you to trust me right away. Just take it one day at a time. That's all anyone can do." His words were simple, but for her, they carried an unexpected weight, proof that someone saw her fear, acknowledged it, and respected it. Trust also grew through shared responsibilities. She helped with chores, tending to the small garden behind the sheriff's office, mending his clothes, and keeping the house orderly. He, in turn, showed her the practicalities of his work. How to read the land for signs of trouble, how to maintain safety while moving through town. Each shared task was a lesson in cooperation, a silent agreement that they could rely on each other. Slowly, the distance between them shortened, replaced by a quiet understanding and mutual respect. There were moments of laughter, too, rare and fragile but deeply precious. A spilled cup of coffee or a mischievous dog from the town wandering into the yard could spark a shared chuckle, and in those moments, the barriers around their hearts softened. It was in these small, everyday incidents that the foundation of trust was truly built. It was not grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but the quiet, consistent presence of one another that allowed them to feel safe, seen, and, most importantly, not alone. By the end of this period, the sheriff noticed he looked forward to her presence in the house, to her voice and even her occasional clumsy mishaps. She too found herself anticipating small moments of interaction, feeling a tentative sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone she could count on. Building trust was not immediate, and it was far from perfect, but the first seeds had been planted, and in the unspoken shared moments of understanding, both realized that they were beginning to find something they had long thought impossible: connection. Just as a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over the sheriff's house, trouble arrived in Red Willow. It came in the form of a group of outsiders, rough men with hard eyes and loose tempers, who had been making their way through the county, stirring fear wherever they went. Rumors had reached the sheriff that they were planning to shake down local businesses and intimidate townsfolk, and their reputation for violence had preceded them. The quiet town, usually orderly and predictable, suddenly felt like a powder keg, and the sheriff knew that both the town and the young woman under his roof were at risk. The first sign of danger came one evening while she was sitting by the window, carefully embroidering a small piece of cloth to occupy her hands. She noticed shadows moving along the street, figures that did not belong to the usual townsfolk. Her heart raced, a cold fear running through her as she realized they were outsiders, rough, threatening men with glances that spoke of mischief and malice. She froze, unsure of how to react, until the sheriff appeared silently at her side, as if he had anticipated her fears. "They're planning something," he said in a low voice, his calm demeanor belying the tension underneath. "Stay inside. Don't make a sound." The simple instructions, though brief, conveyed both protection and urgency. She nodded, heart pounding, and for the first time felt the stark reality of vulnerability in a way that could not be ignored. The following days tested their resolve. The sheriff patrolled the town, ensuring businesses were secured and townspeople were warned. She, though afraid, insisted on helping in small ways, keeping watch from the window, running errands when it was safe, and tending to the house so he could focus on keeping the town secure. In the shared danger, the distance between them narrowed. She saw the strength and skill he had honed through years of service, and he, in turn, saw courage in her that he hadn't expected. Despite her fears, she faced situations that forced her to act decisively, and each time, the sheriff's admiration grew, not just for her bravery, but for her resilience and quick thinking. One night, the group of outsiders confronted the sheriff directly, testing his authority and the town's safety. When they discovered she was staying with him, the danger became more personal. He protected her with unwavering resolve, standing between her and the threat with a quiet but firm authority. She realized in that moment how much he cared, not just as a protector of law, but as someone who had begun to care for her deeply. Through these trials, the sheriff and the young woman were forced to communicate openly in ways they hadn't before. Instructions, warnings, reassurances. They were no longer casual words but lifelines. Their trust was tested under pressure, their fears laid bare, and yet they emerged from each confrontation with a stronger bond. It was in facing danger together that they truly began to see each other, not as strangers under one roof, but as allies, partners, and perhaps something more. By the time the outsiders were finally driven away or left town, the girl and the sheriff had changed in ways neither could have anticipated. The terror they had endured had forged a connection built on mutual reliance, courage, and respect. The sheriff, once entirely self-contained and emotionally distant, found himself thinking of her safety constantly, unable to ignore the protective feelings swelling in his chest. She too felt a sense of belonging she had never known before, realizing that someone was willing to risk everything for her well-being. In the aftermath, Red Willow returned to its quiet routines, but the house above the sheriff's office had changed. It was no longer just a room for a weary traveler. It was a sanctuary of shared experiences, fear and bravery, and both of them recognized, even if only quietly, that their bond had deepened beyond simple trust. The external threat had tested them, and they had survived, not just physically but emotionally, planting the seeds for a bond that would guide the next stages of their story. In the quiet aftermath of the danger that had swept through Red Willow, both the sheriff and the young woman found themselves confronting emotions they had long suppressed. The days of unease and the nights of shared vigilance had left an indelible mark on them. What had started as cautious coexistence had blossomed into something more profound, though neither had dared to name it. For the sheriff, the realization was slow but undeniable. He had begun to care for her in ways that went far beyond duty or habit. For the young woman, the protective presence of the sheriff had evolved into admiration, gratitude, and a budding affection that startled her with its intensity. It began with small, almost imperceptible moments. The sheriff found himself noticing the way she paused to savor a quiet moment in the garden, or how her eyes lit up when she accomplished even a minor task. He felt a pang of longing when she wasn't nearby, a restlessness that had no place in the life of a man who had spent years alone. He caught himself seeking excuses to linger in her presence, to hear her voice, or to exchange a glance that said more than words could convey. Each small smile she offered, each act of trust she extended struck him with a quiet, undeniable force. For her part, she noticed the subtle ways he looked out for her, not just physically but emotionally. How he remembered small details about her preferences, how he waited patiently when she stumbled over words or hesitated to share her thoughts. She realized with a flutter of surprise that she had begun to anticipate his presence, that his steady calm had become a source of comfort she hadn't thought possible. Her heart, once guarded by layers of fear and mistrust, began to open in ways that both exhilarated and frightened her. The turning point came one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The town was quiet, the streets empty, and the air carried the faint scent of dust and wildflowers. She spoke of her past, recounting memories of family she had lost or never truly had, the hardships she had endured, and the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow. The sheriff listened in silence, his hand resting lightly on hers, not as an obligation but as a gesture of connection. When she finished, he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have to carry all of that alone anymore. Not here. Not with me." The weight of his words, so simple yet profound, struck her deeply. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not as someone to be pitied, not as a burden, but as a person worthy of care and belonging. She met his gaze, searching for any hint of falsehood or expectation, and found none. Only honesty, only sincerity, only the beginnings of a bond that could not be broken by fear or uncertainty. In the following days, their feelings became harder to ignore. The sheriff caught himself planning his day around her presence, thinking of ways to make her comfortable, small gestures that revealed a growing affection he had long denied to himself. She in turn found herself anticipating his return from his patrols, worrying when he stayed out later than expected, and feeling a warmth in her chest at his simplest words of encouragement or praise. Though neither spoke of love outright, the realization was mutual. They had grown dependent on one another in a way that went far beyond survival or convenience. The young woman had found a sense of family in the sheriff's quiet, steadfast presence, and the sheriff had discovered that the emptiness he had carried since his wife's death could be filled by someone who brought both courage and compassion into his life. Their hearts, once guarded and lonely, were slowly learning the language of trust, care, and longing, the first step toward something neither had dared to imagine until now. By the end of this chapter in their lives, both understood that what they felt was no longer simple companionship or gratitude. It was deeper, more tender, and entirely transformative. Each had realized that the other had become indispensable, not just as a protector or a guest, but as someone whose presence made life richer, warmer, and infinitely more meaningful. The weeks following the town's brief upheaval had brought a quiet closeness between the sheriff and the young woman, yet both remained acutely aware of the unspoken tension in the house. The sheriff, a man who had lived his life governed by duty and restraint, had become increasingly conscious of his feelings he had long suppressed, feelings that frightened him because they were unfamiliar and powerful. Likewise, the young woman who had spent years learning to trust no one, felt a tug in her heart that she could not ignore. The bond they shared had grown into something undeniable, but the question of whether to act on it loomed large. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the town was bathed in a soft amber glow, the sheriff found himself standing at the edge of the porch, watching her move about the small garden. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say countless times in his head, only to falter when the moment arrived. But the fear of losing her, of allowing hesitation to leave them in limbo, propelled him forward. He called her gently and she turned, brushing soil from her hands, her expression cautious but curious. "I need to speak with you," he began, his voice steady yet carrying an undercurrent of emotion. She nodded, sensing the gravity of his tone, and followed him inside. They settled at the small table by the window, the fading light casting soft shadows across their faces. The sheriff took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability he rarely showed to anyone. "These past weeks, you've become more important to me than I ever expected," he admitted. "I didn't plan for it and I tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore. I care for you, more than just as someone I'm responsible for." Her heart raced. She had felt it too, but the confirmation of his words sent a jolt of both hope and fear through her. I feel the same," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I've been hurt before. I don't know if I can risk trusting again." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, reflecting years of pain and the fragile hope that had just begun to bloom. The sheriff reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. "You won't have to face it alone," he said. "I can't promise that everything will be easy, but I can promise you won't have to do it by yourself. Not ever." The sincerity in his eyes, the steadiness in his tone, provided a warmth that broke through her walls piece by piece. For the first time, she truly believed that someone could care for her without condition or expectation. And yet the choice still lay with her. She could stay, embrace the uncertainty and hope for a future together, or retreat into the safety of solitude and self-protection. She sat in silence for a long moment, weighing the risk of heartache against the rare possibility of love and belonging. The room seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath their chairs. Finally, she lifted her gaze, determination mingling with vulnerability. "I'll stay," she said softly, because I want to, and I trust you." The words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of courage and hope. The sheriff's chest tightened with relief and quiet joy, knowing that the walls he had built around his heart were finally beginning to crumble. Not from fear, but from love. That night, the house above the sheriff's office felt different. It was no longer just a place of safety or shelter. It had become a home in every sense of the word. Their confessions had bridged the gap between solitude and connection, fear and trust, loneliness and love. Both understood that the journey ahead would bring challenges, but for the first time, they were ready to face them together. In the end, the choice was mutual, a willingness to open their hearts to embrace uncertainty and to build something lasting from the fragments of their separate pasts. It was a step that required courage, honesty, and vulnerability, and it was a step that neither of them would ever regret. The days that followed their quiet confession felt different, lighter somehow. The tension that had once filled the sheriff's home had softened, replaced by the warmth of companionship and shared understanding. It wasn't a sudden transformation. Love, after all, grows like dawn rather than lightning, but each sunrise brought a new peace neither had known in years. The sheriff found himself smiling more, not the polite smile of a lawman maintaining appearances, but one that came from a genuine sense of contentment. For years, his life had been built around structure and solitude, patrols, reports, and the silent ache of a home too empty. Now the emptiness was gone. The sound of her humming while sweeping the floor or tending the small garden outside brought life to rooms that had long been quiet. Her laughter, rare but sincere, seemed to chase away the ghosts of loss that had haunted him for so long. For her, the change was even more profound. The small room above the sheriff's office no longer felt temporary. It was home. She had unpacked completely, placed her few belongings on shelves, and even stitched a small curtain for the window. Every day she woke with a purpose, tending the garden, helping with town chores, and sometimes even bringing lunch to the sheriff when he was too absorbed in work to eat. The townsfolk, who had once eyed her with suspicion, began to greet her kindly now, seeing the change in her spirit. They noticed how she carried herself with quiet confidence, no longer the frightened stranger who had arrived with dust on her boots and sorrow in her eyes. Together, she and the sheriff created a life built on mutual respect and care. Their connection deepened through shared routines, mornings spent discussing the day ahead, evenings reading by the fire, the occasional teasing remark that made them both laugh. The sheriff, once haunted by the memory of his late wife, finally felt at peace with the past. He realized that love didn't replace what was lost. It simply grew alongside it, offering a new chapter where grief once lived. One afternoon, the sheriff found her sitting on the porch steps, mending one of his old shirts. The sight struck him more deeply than he expected. He sat beside her, the air between them filled with the easy quiet of two souls who no longer needed words to communicate. "You've made this place different," he said softly. "Better. Brighter." She smiled, her eyes meeting his. "It's not just the place," she replied. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. A reason to stay." The sheriff's gaze softened and he reached out to take her hand, his touch gentle yet sure. "Then I'm glad you stayed," he murmured. It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of every hardship, every lonely night, and every act of faith that had brought them to this moment. As time passed, the sense of family they created extended beyond the walls of their home. The sheriff's house became a place of welcome. Townsfolk stopped by more often, children waved as they passed, and laughter became a familiar sound in the evenings. Even the hardest hearts in Red Willow began to soften, recognizing in their bond a reflection of what the town itself needed most: compassion, understanding, and second chances. For the young woman, what began as a refuge had turned into belonging. She no longer thought of leaving. Her roots had taken hold in the red earth of the town and in the heart of the man who had once lived only for duty. For the sheriff, her presence had transformed his grief into gratitude. He had thought his life was over in all the ways that mattered, but she had shown him that healing was possible, that love could bloom even after years of silence. And so, as another sunset spilled gold across the horizon, the two of them stood side by side on the porch, watching the light fade and the stars begin to appear. Neither spoke, but both knew what the silence meant. They had found their family, not through blood or obligation, but through choice, kindness, and the courage to love again. In that small, quiet town, the lonely sheriff and the girl who once had no family finally had both, a home and each other.